As she mentioned, Dan Hosang is an associate professor of ethnicity, race, and migration in American Studies and holds a secondary appointment in the Department of Political Science at Yale University. Dan taught at the University of Oregon in Political Science and Ethnic Studies from 2007 to 2017 and collaborated with LERC on several projects. Dan was also a member of the executive committee of the United Academics, AAUP, AFT, Local 3209, which is the faculty union at our university. Dan is also the author and co-editor of 5 books, which I encourage you to pick one up, on racial justice. His next book to be released this fall is entitled A Wider Type of Freedom: How Struggle for Racial Justice Liberates Everyone. His talk tonight, Racism, Austerity, and the Public Good, is based in part on his co-authored book with Joe Lowndes, who we previously had, entitled Producers, Parasites, Patriots, Race and the New Right-Wing Politics of Precarity, as well as research and advocacy project on the public reconstruction and organizing campaign for public goods. He is done with the Seattle-based Alliance for a Just Society. So Dan, take us to school, brother.
Oh, all right. Hi, everybody. I'm really, really grateful to be invited to be in your presence. Thanks so much, Sherman and Jennifer. I was telling Sherman and Jennifer just before we started, I was at the U of O for 10 years. I so miss so many of my colleagues, the relationships, the culture of solidarity built there, especially around labor issues. So I told them I kind of didn't realize what I had until I left in some ways. So I'm just grateful to be in your company. Look forward to sharing some of this work with you and hearing your thoughts. But first, Sherman, I have something for you. Are you ready?
I guess.
Yeah. All right. So let me start this off here. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the ways that I think some new trends and dynamics and challenges for labor unions as they relate to austerity, racism, and a vision of kind of public goods and public reconstruction. But this is what we're going to do, Sherman, all right? Are you ready?
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to do a little quiz between you and I. I have a question here. I'm going to put the question, you're going to see the answers. And then your people on our call tonight are going to have to weigh in, kind of like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire style, to help you get the right answer, okay? We got 3 questions for you. You ready?
Yeah.
All right, so here's the first question. Which group launched this public campaign declaring that, quote, Black people have the right to move without fear, unquote? Is it A, Uber, B, the Transportation Workers Union, C, Gig Workers Rising, or D, Greyhound? Sherman, first let's let folks weigh in to help you out here.
Sure, no, absolutely.
All right.
Any guesses?
So put it in the chat what you have. D, B. You need more help, Sherman. All right, we got some B's.
Come on now, come on, folks.
In B, I'm seeing the gamut.
You're kind of.
It would be just painful if it was Uber, but golly. Yeah, cynical. It's a cynical choice.
All right, Sherman, I think we got our time here. So what do you have? A, B, C, or D?
I'm seeing more with B.
You think
I'm going to go with the crowd with B.
The B. All right, the union, right? That the union should be doing this, right? All right, let's see. The answer is A, Uber.
Uber, whoa, man.
Yes. Ouch. And so, and this is, it was a billboard campaign nationally, also a social media campaign. You can see where this kind of logo is from. So I want to point to folks' attention, calling directly, tracing a line from the March on Washington to police shootings of Black people. The the kind of tagline was, if you tolerate racism, delete Uber. And the idea was, you know, in the face of racism that Black folks face in terms of like taxis, that Uber was an anti-racist way. And this is, of course, in the middle of their fight for Prop 22 in California, which carved out this special exception to lower labor standards for gig economy workers. And this is important for us because as we're thinking about the connection between labor and anti-racism, nearly every large corporation is also making these moves and positioning themselves as kind of bearing the anti-racist framework, okay? So this is one thing I want to just like put in front of our eyes is how this is happening. And, you know, just the trippy thing is they're doing this, again, as they're actively fighting, you know, a campaign of primarily Black and brown workers in California and many other places. All right, Sherman, you ready for the next one?
Yes, sir.
All right, here we go. Which of these companies has launched a national PR campaign proclaiming their support for a $15 an hour minimum wage? Is it A, Walmart, B, Apple, C, Powell's Books, D, Amazon? So let's let folks weigh in.
Well, it seems overwhelmingly D. I'm not seeing any other votes.
I think people have been set up here, Sherman, but I don't know, you know.
But there's a desire that it's C.
All right.
Yeah, I like this.
What do you want to go with there?
I'm gonna go with D. Gonna go with the audience.
D. Yeah, you got to go with the audience.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is D, Amazon. And, you know, there was a point in the chat about, and I certainly don't mean to put in Uber and saying, look, they took out ads, so they're anti-racist. It's actually the opposite of that. But this is the same thing. So as Amazon is fighting the organizing campaign in Alabama, lowering labor standards everywhere, they're positioning themselves as champions of low-wage workers. And this is really, really important. So, you know, the argument is, lest you think the labor unions are championing the rights of low-wage workers. That's not the case. It's Amazon, actually, who has the backs of low-wage workers. And so really important to think about how these things are working together, okay?
Sure.
Not just the policy thing, but Amazon and many corporations' efforts to position themselves as the champions and spokespersons of working people. All right, Sherman, we got one more, okay?
Sure.
We're 1 for 1. What percentage of union households did Donald Trump win in 2020? What percentage of union households? This is according to exit polls. This is nationally. A, 5%, B, 15%, C, 30%, D, 40%. All right, let's let folks weigh in here first.
I'm seeing a lot of D's here in the chat. 1 C, couple C's, 1 C. A desire for A. C's and D's I'm seeing, Sherman.
C's and D.
C or D, I like that. All right. All right, Sherman. The people have spoken.
Yes, yes.
Where are you at?
I'm not gonna do like Georgia. I'm not gonna overrule their vote. So I'm gonna go with D.
No, yeah, you gotta go.
Gotta go with D.
D, all right.
Lottie says D.
It was D, 40%. A couple of things to note here. This actually was a much lesser margin. So Biden won a much higher percentage of union households than Clinton did in 2016. In some states, Trump did win, in Ohio in particular, a majority of union households. But partly what I want to say here, and you know, we can see it in the chat about this, of course, like gap between who Trump represented, what his campaign did, his record, but also the sense that he could also represent the interests of union members and working people. And so the part of what I want to say here is it's not just our challenge kind of like out there, the people who might be duped, that Amazon or Uber are champions of working people. It's indeed union members, workers, all of us that are also kind of swimming in, inhabiting, living in these kind of very confusing waters. And so I want us to come back to this if we can, Sherman, because this is like This is your area because this is really about labor education and what the role is of unions and labor educators in equipping all of us, members, organizers, others, to navigate these really complex kind of times, okay? So those are the, but I think Sherman, you passed, you know, with the help of the people here.
Yes, it's all about the people.
It's all about the people. Right.
I enjoyed this, Dan. This is great.
Okay, so this is, so we're gonna set this up, Sherman. We're gonna come back to all of these, okay?
Yes.
So here's what I want to lay out in terms of themes and ideas, and I hope at different points I'll just be able to stop. At any point, please put things in the questions, the chat, ideas, observations, but I'm going to try to do this in 4 parts here. The first part is the union's fight is not my fight, is really about a recent turn that bosses and employers are making to recruit workers to be the kind of leading edge and the face of the attacks against unions. So rather than it being bosses, it's actually workers who are narrating why unions have to, or trying to delegitimate the role of unions. The second, and this is where we're really going to think about how this involves race. How does it feel to be a problem? This is the famous quote of W.B. Du Bois from 1903, which is about how does it feel to be the person that's proposed as the problem facing the nation, the people. And as labor in general and public sector unions in particular are framed as problems, it's really important for unions to understand that history and how a long record of mostly Black-led anti-racist social movements against that, because this is going to be critical for unions and workers to understand. The third is first they came for the teachers, and this is in some ways, this is from the book that Joe Lowndes and I worked on for several years about some of the challenges that unions are facing in trying to do this and trying to figure out how to respond to these conditions. And then the last part towards a public reconstruction is really where I'm hoping that we can think about, you know, in the face of these challenges and conditions, what might be possible. Okay, so those are the 4 parts we're going to talk about. Okay, the union's fight is not my fight. So, you know, I think we often think about this, and, you know, before graduate school, you know, I spent some time with SEIU 1199 doing building sector organizing, home care organizing. And, you know, we're often, when we're organizing on the, like at the work site, trying to, I mean, ultimately get there, this notion that there is a struggle between, on the one hand, workers and their interests, and on the other hand, the bosses who employ them, and trying to sharpen that understanding. And of course, it's through labor unions that workers are able to have the power to contend with and fight back against bosses. Part of what I want to say is that in the face of that, part of what, and especially as inequality in our country has grown so profound and in some ways so indefensible, that rather than simply attacking like workers as being undeserving or too greedy, that there's been a shift in which bosses are trying to suggest that they best represent the interests of workers. And in this case, the workers' interests get pitted as against the unions. So it's no longer workers against bosses, but it's workers against their unions. And then in this context, who is it that can kind of save and represent and help to indeed lift up the interests of workers, but corporations? So I want to just talk about this shift. And, you know, just one way to think about this. So this is Mark Janus, who was the named plaintiff in the famous Janus v. AFSCME case that took away the kind of like, you know, effectively the union shop for public sector workers in a Supreme Court case. And the important thing here is that, you know, Janus is represented, he was an Illinois state employee. And this was partly what he said, you know, the union's fight is not my fight. Now, he was recruited by anti-union forces to take this up, but they were very, very, you know, this was their very specific agenda, which was to argue that it was workers who were being harmed by the unions. It wasn't bosses, it wasn't the unequal economy, it wasn't unfair taxes. It was unions themselves that were harming workers. This, in fact, this is the Liberty Justice Center is one of the legal think tanks that finances so many of these anti-union lawsuits. And I just want to point out that their like aesthetic here and the like logo could, I mean, if I took the bottom part away, you would think this is coming directly from a union itself, Stand With Workers, right? So so it's actually not discounting or attacking workers. It's claiming that that anti-union forces are in workers' best interests. This is Rebecca Friedrichs, who is the named plaintiff in this also very important case, Friedrichs versus the California Teachers Association. And this is, the quote that kind of circulated in the media: "I was shunned by the union and treated like a second-class citizen." And you see this all around happening. I'm going to play a short video. This is from the Liberty Justice Center ad. They support probably at any given time 10 anti-union lawsuits, all often about the kind of contract and dues provisions of public sector contracts. Here's an ad from a case against an SEIU local in Philadelphia.
Being from Philadelphia is great. I graduated from Temple in 2012. I'm an avid traveler, and I want to make sure that every penny that I have is towards something that I believe in. I'm an income maintenance caseworker for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It's definitely fulfilling. So as far as working for the Commonwealth, that literally means that I'm working for the people, of Pennsylvania. Initially, my relationship with the union was very good. Over time, I just saw that there's kind of a lackadaisical approach to the needs of the workers there. When I tried to resign from the union, they told me I couldn't, despite the Janus decision, until the end of the contract period. I got frustrated enough and contacted Liberty Justice Center for assistance. I would say that this lawsuit is about rights. It's definitely about your right to choose whether or not you want to be in a union, because that's the right that we were granted with the Janus decision.
So I'm curious, I just might ask folks in the chat, I see someone saying that was a strategy used by the Freedom Foundation, kind of what folks are seeing there, like what's the strategy there? In the ways that plaintiffs are recruited, and also the ways their stories are narrated. And if you go to their website, you'll see 9 of these, each with calling a very similar script. So to think about what they're trying to do there in these campaigns. Just a couple more examples. This is, there's a different, racism inside unions is exploited to build anti-union sentiment. So there are histories of exclusion and some question that the union is incapable of representing the working interests of Black women, for example. So I don't think that's an accident. These are just some very quick examples from Maine. This was a ballot initiative in Maine a few years ago when One Fair Wage, these are folks who are trying to eliminate the subminimum tipped wage that allows restaurants, but not only just restaurants, other employers as well, to pay below the minimum wage, the idea that tips make up for it. And the way the employers fought back against this was not actually about their interests. They didn't talk about their bottom line as much. They didn't talk about just about their profitability. What they did is formed a group that they called Restaurant Workers of Maine. And all of the ads fronted workers. They were workers talking about, they were trying to kind of get this idea out that this is not a transitional kind of summertime employment. This is my long-term career, and wages actually, tipped wages have allowed this to be a stable career for me. So again, not speaking here in terms of the interests of employers and their profit margins or any of the things we often associate, but actually raising up workers' profiles and biographies and narratives as kind of attacks or ways to, and just to unpack this a little bit, right? So this is workers saying, we don't want a state-enforced raise. A state-enforced raise, in other words, guaranteeing us the minimum. And of course, the argument is you get raised to the minimum, then you get tips on top of that. And in all other states that don't have a sub-minimum wage tip, tips don't go down. But this is actually workers saying to the state, do not elevate our minimum wage. That would be against our interests. And rather than just seeing this as a, I don't know, just a kind of like a tricky PR campaign, which in some ways it is, I just want us to take a step back and think about this kind of increasing ways in which these attacks are narrated, not in the interest of employers, but in the interest of workers. Okay. Number two, how does it feel? And yes, you know, Jennifer said they have no shame, they will say anything, but anyone that's worked on a organizing campaign knows that, right? Bosses will indeed say anything, and we have to be attentive to what they're saying and how they're attempting to win the kind of hearts and minds of workers, not just defend their own interests and their own profit-making interests. All right, this is an ad, and I'm sure there's examples of this in Oregon, other places. This comes from the kind of like right-wing public policy shop in Connecticut, Balanced Worker Pay, Balanced State Budget, in which the benefits and wages of public sector workers are argued come at the expense of non-government workers, private sector workers. So this is, again, this is not an argument against public sector workers and wages from like taxpayers, which is often the framework. The idea here is that this comes at the expense of other workers, that their benefits, their pensions, et cetera, their pay hurts workers. This was in 2010. Remember when Scott Walker, the governor of Wisconsin, kind of engaged in a really public attack and effort to undermine the rights and standards of public sector workers. And again, narrated in the same language. We can no longer live in a society where the public employees are the haves and the taxpayers who foot the bills are the have-nots. These kind of privileged workers as against a lower sector of workers. This is Rush Limbaugh, parasites of government. They are freeloaders who live off of your tax payments and they want more. They don't produce anything. They live solely off the output of the private sector. And this notion of public sector workers as parasites, as freeloaders, feeding at the public trough is an ongoing theme, an ongoing way in which they're trying to organize public sentiment against both public sector workers and public sector programs in general. And what I want to suggest is to understand this notion of being charged with being a parasite, being charged with being dependent, living off the labor of someone else. To really trace that out, we have to trace out a long, long history of, in particular, anti-Black racism in this country. So this is an ad that comes out as a way to discredit the Freedmen's Bureau, which was the federal agency charged with nominally supporting the lives of freed people in the South. And of course, the argument here was any government efforts to make freed people's lives livable was account to simply subsidizing their kind of leisurely lifestyle because they were never capable of working and supporting themselves. They were always, and the implicit argument here is that the kind of white wage earner was being forced to pay for the kind of like leisurely and corrupt behavior of freed Black people. This is an ongoing, I mean, we're talking like, you know, well over 150 years old. And we see this across Reconstruction and across this period where the interests of the kind of, again, hard-earning producerist white man are contrasted to the kind of freeloading person of color, Black person in particular. Again, you know, hundreds and hundreds of these images. The tagline here on this cartoon, the popular idea of the Freedmen's Bureau, plenty to eat and nothing to do. So if we're wondering, where does this idea of the parasite come from? This is, you know, in many ways, its origins. In popular culture, if we think about this contrast between the producer, the autonomous, the self-possessed, kind of sovereign person, the cowboy figure, the John Wayne, as against the parasite, the person incapable of standing on their own. Certainly the welfare queen stereotype really animates and expresses this. Dependency, gender dependency, living off the labor of others. And then we can even see it, remember, folks will remember in the 2008 campaign, John McCain rolls out this figure, Joe the plumber. don't spread my wealth, spread my work ethic. That is the whole reason. That's why a kind of somewhat random plumber, I think he was from Ohio, suddenly appears and is made to have, you know, like meaning in McCain's campaign, is because he's meant to embody the producer. We can see the ways this producer versus parasite kind of contrast works in debates around immigration. You know, all of these, you know, like nativist xenophobic ads claiming that immigration is associated with trying to get benefits at the expense of the taxpayer. And so part of what we argued in this book is that the whole reason that this notion of union parasites makes sense, or is in any way like people can get their head around, is because they already have their head around this figure of the dependent parasitic person, and that person is a racialized, gendered figure. So even if unions haven't thought about this before, they have to think about it now. Even unions that are largely or even overwhelmingly white, which was the case in Wisconsin. Public sector workers, even in Wisconsin, are something like 85% white, very similar to the population as a whole. And yet these racist histories absolutely can be deployed against them. We use this idea of racial transposition, an idea that was first developed here, attacking Black people, Black women, people of color, is now brought to bear. We are not in any way saying that the positions are equivalent, that white union workers are somehow occupy the same status. But what we're saying is that the whole charge of dependency that for so many years was deployed against people of color is now available as a kind of generalized form of attack. Just a couple of other examples of this. And so this was a skit, a Saturday Night Live skit in 2010, where they had something called the Public Employee of the Year Award. And the whole idea here was to make a joke. They were going to give an award. It was like an award center kind of like skit kind of thing about who the laziest public sector worker was. And they start with actually, you know, the first kind of like contestant is this Black woman, Siberney, I think the actress's name is, who, you know, enacts like all the like most sexist, racist stereotypes associated with Black women that are familiar, and those are introduced. And then the eventual winner is like a white janitor from New York who collects like 6 paychecks, and he's given the Public Sector Union Award. And just 2 things I want to say about this. If it enters the discourse in like a Saturday Night Live skit, then there's some understanding. I mean, it was a terrible skit, that it's somehow publicly legible. And you can really see here how, again, the stereotypes long associated with Black women are then kind of redeployed in these other ways. And I just want to be very clear, we're not talking about a structural position. You saw this in the Chicago Teachers Union strike in 2012. This is a kind of right-wing picture of Karen Lewis, the wonderful, brave, brilliant leader of the Chicago Teachers Union who passed away recently. And I'll show you these things. It's a notion of like the unions as like gluttonous and largesse at the expense of the broke kind of white taxpayer. And once this is established, I mean, these are very familiar cartoons where we see government kind of quote unquote government public sector workers as enlarged and fattened, kind of sucking the life out of the taxpayer. And so part of what I want to say is like, we might read these as like, well, what does this have to do with race? This has everything to do with race, because the whole way, yes, this is takers versus makers. That was Romney's argument in 2012, right? There's some people that make, there's some that take. And for many years, like, I just want to say, you know, these public sector workers, toll booth collectors, custodians, teachers thought like, how am I all of a sudden the cause of this like global meltdown? What did I do? Right? Having this, how did I become a problem? And the point is that once this discourse is established, that there's some people in the takers and some in the makers, everybody can be subject to its kind of effects. Right? So we constantly see this thing. And the only way these work is always by contrasts. The overwhelmed private sector emancipated worker against the fattened public sector union. I might just, let's see what our time is. I'm going to show you 2 minutes of a clip that came from Inside Edition. You know, it's like that new news magazine that they got from a story. This is like a a kind of Koch brothers funded network, Americans for Prosperity California. And they did these like webisodes called Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous on a Government Pension. And Inside Edition picked one of these up. It was actually this attack on lifeguards in Orange County. And I just want to play it for 2 minutes just to also point out, look, lifeguards, these are like the whitest of like white guys, you know, protected by all forms of like both white privilege and gendered privilege, and yet can be subject to these attacks. So I'm just going to play like 2 minutes so you can just kind of see how this gets narrated. Sorry.
And here's a story that may get you a little upset. Lifeguards are critical to safety at beaches around the country. But in California, some senior lifeguards are taking home more than $200,000 a year. Lisa Guerrero and the I Squad investigate why.
Baywatch babe Pamela Anderson and David Hasselhoff made big bucks playing California lifeguards on TV. And believe it or not, some real California lifeguards make very large incomes too. Some actually earn more than $200,000 a year. While there's no disputing the important rescue work lifeguards provide, here in scenic Newport Beach, it certainly pays big bucks to patrol the waves. 9 of Newport Beach's 13 full-time lifeguards make over $150,000 a year in total compensation.
I did not know that.
Yeah. You didn't know that?
I want to be a lifeguard.
And that's burning up a lot of people.
This is unbelievable. How can lifeguards make this kind of money?
David Spady of Americans for Prosperity is outraged by the high salaries.
The reason that lifeguards have some of the most coveted jobs in Southern California is not just because they get to talk to girls in bikinis and work on their suntans. It's because they have these incredible, generous packages for salaries.
But are taxpayers really getting their money's worth? To find out, we decided to follow some of the lifeguards during their work days. Lifeguard Gary Conwell earns over $140,000 a year with benefits. But on this day, instead of trying to keep the beaches safe, we found him playing beach volleyball with other lifeguards for over an hour, all while on the clock. Maybe you think that that would upset his boss. Well, this is his boss. As Assistant Chief of Lifeguard Operations, Rob Williams earns over $240,000 a year with benefits. On this day, we spotted Williams leaving the station shortly after 2 p.m. Apparently, his trash needed some rescuing at home. Time records obtained by Inside Edition show he's scheduled to work till 5 p.m. But here he is, slipping out 2.5 hours early to do chores, run errands, and take one of his cars to the auto shop for repairs. And watch what he did on another day. He left work 5 hours early. We followed him on the 405 freeway as he drove some 400 miles north, all the way to San Francisco. So, where did he finally end up? At this water polo match where his daughter was competing. But
I'm going to stop it there because I think you get the idea of the story. It kind of culminates in them confronting him. And what's both striking about it is these questions like answer for yourself, and his like kind of stunning response, like, you followed me all the way up here. I like, he kind of can't get his head around it. The other thing that's happening is this is over an effort to privatize those positions, to take them out of the town's employment and privatize them. You know, they eventually acknowledge that all of this was covered under the contract. Of course, lifeguards need to work out. They continue to cite their total benefit packages so that their salary, their retirement, and everything. But, you know, I just want to say this is a case like, you know, the state has long absolutely micromanaged the lives of women of color who get public benefits, immigrants, et cetera. You're absolutely expected to be answerable at every moment to the state. That notion, what are you doing? Explain yourself. There's nothing new about that. That's the basic condition. It's in the public charge. It's built in to how most people of color relate to the state. But there is something of, you know, these guys saying like, how is this coming to me now? What did I do to deserve this? But the logic is absolutely the same. Defend yourself. You have to explain why you're in this position. So this notion about and again, think about this, the silent majority, that was the, that's the expression that was long associated with the kind of like muzzled, hardworking white populace that wasn't going to complain about their issues in contrast to all these other, the feminists, the Black militants and others who are rebelling. And now that same silent majority is being applied to this contrast of public sector unions. I want to just say something a little bit now as we kind of go into this like second part about how, especially in the wake of 2010, unions attempted to respond to this charge that you're a parasite, that you're draining resources, that you have to answer for yourself. This was in Ohio, there was a similar effort to undermine collective bargaining rights for a whole range of public sector workers, including so-called emergency workers, public safety workers, first responders. In response, a statewide coalition was put together to try to, and they were able to defeat this bill. I want to play this ad that was run by the kind of broad union coalition against the measure, and to have us kind of like unpack it a little bit.
When there's an emergency, we need to be ready. We put our trust in our equipment, our training, and most of all, our fellow firefighters. But Issue 2 makes it illegal for us to negotiate for enough firefighters to do the job. Fewer firefighters means slower response times, and that can mean the difference between life and death. Issue 2 makes it harder for us to do our jobs, and that's not safe for us or the neighborhoods that we serve. When the call comes in, let's make sure Ohio firefighters are ready. Vote no on Issue 2.
Now, the reason why they would emphasize firefighters, cops, sometimes nurses, maybe one ad around teachers, publicly sympathetic figures to try to say this is the impact if voters vote to repeal this. But I want to say part of what the subtext is clearly is this notion that we are producers, not parasites. In other words, we don't belong in this category of the takers. We are in some ways the makers. And that's why you shouldn't, you have us mixed up with someone else. We've been falsely accused of being parasitic. But if you look at the work we do, we actually belong on the other side. That's the exact response that the lifeguards gave as well. It's not actually, everyone is entitled to a decent living. These are services we all benefit from. That's not the claim that's made. The claim that's made is go pick on someone else. We're not guilty of what you're charging us with. Now, to defeat this legislation, absolutely, that makes sense. This ad actually won an award from the people that give awards to political campaigns. But I want to say in the long run, it really does set up very treacherous terrain, because certainly not every public sector worker, not every worker can make that defense. What I do is heroic and producer and go pick on someone else. And as long as there's someone else to pick on, the notion that you're going to be protected from that, is kind of a fantasy. And so trying to always defend yourself through the language of producerism, I want to say has profound limits and leaves many, many people vulnerable to those attacks, including the people making them here. Here's the last one. This is a rally from Providence, Rhode Island, an AFT rally, an attack. This is when there was a comment in the chat, kind of this notion like, look at these teachers, they get summers off, they barely have to do anything. They're kind of like, they're taking advantage of all of us. And you can see this quote, first they came for the teachers and I didn't speak up. And what might we say about first they came for the teachers? Of course they didn't come for the teachers first, right? These attacks have been happening for more than a century. And the only way you would think that first they came for the teachers is if you imagined that your own life and your possibilities were in fact deeply disconnected to all those other attacks, all the other folks who were attacked before you on precisely the same grounds. Now I want to say, and I'll talk about this there's many examples of teachers, certainly Chicago, LA, who absolutely are taking this on and saying the well-being of teachers is directly tied to the well-being of students and communities, et cetera. they're interdependent. But you know, this notion that somehow these attacks first came or only visible when the teachers experienced them showed, at least at the time for this local, some of those gaps. Okay, so just to summarize this, and then we're going to go to the last point, and then I really just look forward to a discussion. More workers being enlisted to fight against unions. More workers being enlisted to fight against unions. The anti-union campaigns draw on subtle but unmistakable ways of racialized histories and stereotypes. That's part of what makes them, that's part of why, just we think back to like 2008, 2009, you know, the evidence was clear about Wall Street's role in producing this catastrophic economic crisis. And yet instantly, you know, these workers could be lifted up as the culprits. And why is that? It's because there is these deeply worn assumptions about someone being parasitic. And once that's established, it was, we shouldn't be surprised that it would be deployed against at new sites. And that just, this is important, that their goal is to isolate unions from their support in order to defeat them. So in other words, the appeal to the public is they, unions, have a stake in your demise. Your well-being is not tied to the well-being of labor unions. And for you to feel safe and whole, you have to join me in the attack on labor unions. That's the kind of playbook here. Okay, last section, and then just really look forward to people's thoughts, questions, et cetera. And I want to do just two things very, very quickly here. One is, you know, so many folks are familiar with this framework of bargaining for the common good, which I think really, which is the idea that for public sector workers especially, their working conditions are always tied to the services they provide, the communities they inhabit, et cetera. So I'm going to just talk very quickly about a campaign in Connecticut that's a bargaining for the common good campaign, knowing that these happen in kind of lots of other places. And what you're seeing here is a broad, is a cross section of workers, but also community members, immigrant rights groups, groups working around prison reform and prison issues, all coming together in Connecticut around a revenue bill to try to tax the billionaires. And part of what I want to just say, so this is it's a formation that's centered on unions. So SEIU, the teachers union, the state AFL-CIO, they've done caravans to the governor's house. The governor is a kind of like finance Democrat who refuses to budge around any of the revenue issues. They've done actions and speak outs, but I just want to give you two very quick examples. We did, and I went to a car caravan at the governor's house. So there was maybe about 100 of us in front of the house, and then something like 200 cars. But what was so moving about this is that outside people's cars, people indicated their union, their community organization, and there were people from like really dozens and dozens of groups. And part of it, it's not just, I mean, coalitions, there's nothing new about that, but I think there's something that's very like experientially striking about everyone seeing all the different formations, the immigrant rights groups, the housing rights groups, the groups working around against racial profiling, education, all of these kind of being able to see one another, if that makes sense. To see it's not just a coalition that the staff decided on, that our fates, our lives are actually connected to this. Right? All of us, none of us can kind of survive unless we're all here. And then the other place this really came through was they had a day-long virtual testimony where I think like 150 people testified in favor of these revenue measures. The legislators were like dying to get out of there. But there was just something also very, very powerful about hearing the tenants' right person testify right after the immigrant rights folks, right after the teachers unions, right after the community college workers. It's actually seeing structurally how people's lives are connected together. And I think, you know, there's something very, very just tangible and material about how we build a response to that notion that unions are these isolated, self-interested actors when people are put in motion together that way. The second thing I'll talk about just very, very quickly is a project I'm involved in around public goods organizing campaigns. So public goods are everything from public education, public transportation, parks, water quality, housing, the revenue we need to fund all of it, elections. and to think about, while all of these are in different issue areas, they are actually all in service of a vision of democratically controlled, well-funded public provisions that benefit everyone in response to the notion of privatized goods, that it's the market that delivers things. And what we're really trying to do in this campaign is to learn from one another. So the effort to increase funding for community colleges in Washington is connected to transportation funding. It's connected to having enough tax revenue to fund housing. And we have to, it's not just, again, kind of like tactical coalitions to help people see the ways these issues are connected in one another's lives. And these are some of the kind of public webinars and other things we've done. So this is, I'll just say, there's just 2 more slides here, an effort for public goods campaigns to sharpen their strategies, think about how their constituencies, which are often separated, have a shared stake in one another's fights, and then developing messages, framing, and narrative that support these campaigns. So we've been doing these labs, and this is just an example of one tomorrow. I'll put the link in the chat. This is a broad-based coalition in New York that just won a pretty significant victory in taxing the billionaires to fund a broad range of services, including a huge educational equity effort. So the public sector unions are, you know, this is like their contracts that are getting funded now, but also getting funded are like lunch programs, are programs focusing on tenants' rights, all of this work together, and all of us have an investment in understanding how things like this get passed and how we can sharpen our campaigns. This is the last slide, and I just want to say, and this is where I'm inviting colleagues, especially in labor education, to think about this question. We still have, you know, the wonderful labor education programs at Oregon, at many public institutions, are effects of labor union struggles, that we needed places and sites and institutions to help educate and train workers, organizers. And as many folks know, the legacy of that has often been a set of skills, you know, for stewards around contract negotiations, all the things that make union locals like thrive. But I also want to say that in this very vexing environment filled with these kind of quite confusing attacks, I think there's a really important role for labor educators to play in helping workers and unions think about these conditions and how they might respond. So this question about how we, not just among staff, but among rank and file workers, deepen and complex our understanding of these conditions so that we can build around them is, I think, an important challenge, because many unions haven't really developed the capacity to engage the rank and file workers around these kinds of questions. It just hasn't been a part of the way they relate to their members. And it just feels like this has to be a time when we rethink these new opportunities. Okay, thank you very much for listening. That's the presentation. I really look forward to your questions. Now I'm going to stop the slides here.
Dan, I don't know if you are looking at the chat now, but I see there's a lot of interest about messaging. And I saw from your last slides that coalition building seems to be a really important aspect of creating a multi-pronged attack against the attacks on public sector unions. You know, your struggle is my struggle kind of things. Do you have any other things that you've noticed have been effective counterweights to their PR machines?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I feel like, so it's such an important question, and I would love to hear just other examples of where it feels like it's working. I think we all know that that's the case now, that these coalitions are indispensable. I think the challenge has been, they've often been short term. When a budget, you know, when something is being debated on at the legislature, they feel then kind of transactional. They're often based on pretty short-term interests, often for public sector unions getting their contracts funded. And often they only go kind of so deep. They typically involve the staff, maybe a layer of leadership. But for most members who are often not involved in contract campaigns, and I know that's not true for every local, but when they're not, it actually doesn't build out those kind of like member-to-member connections. And so I think that part of the practice I've seen in Connecticut that feels exciting is actually getting not just the staff from the immigrant rights groups, but their members in conversation with members of the community college local and the teachers union and the state workers to try to help people figure out like how they're, it's not just about a message of solidarity, it's actually how our lives are connected. And the structures of our organizations, I think, often limit that kind of exchange. So how do we, does that make sense? So it's not just about like so-called silos, it's that our organizations are structured to really limit the ways that people can connect with one another. And I think that's part of the challenge ahead, not just putting a coalition together on paper.
Yeah, and I wonder how that ties into another question about how to, address the disparities in representation in our unions, how to get some of our marginalized populations into leadership positions, and like what, of course, every population has different interests, but what is maybe some common interests that can draw a more diverse group to leadership in unions and people joining the union, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a great question. I mean, my sense is the locals that have done it well. And so I think of, United Teachers of Los Angeles, Chicago Teachers Unions, where they said, look, absolutely, our contracts have to deliver for our members, wages, working conditions, et cetera. But, our contracts can also take up the lives of our students. They can take up racial profiling. They can take up immigration attacks that affects, in both those cities, the lives of many, many families. They can take up the issues of bus drivers, cafeteria workers. So I think when unions have an expansive sense of what their role is around, the calls to shift public safety strategies away from heavy law enforcement presence and towards, both nonviolent responses, but also responses focused on like human services and dignity. All of those things, I think it's substantively, that's what moves people in. That's what gets people engaged. It's not just about looking at your slate about who's running for a rep and thinking, oh my God, it's like a bunch of guys again. Like maybe I'll ask so-and-so at this work site if she'll be willing to run. That's not a substantive way to diversify. The substantive way to do it is to think in much more expansive ways about how we can take these issues on, I think.
And I've noticed, I guess anyone on Twitter these days has noticed the, and you touched on this very briefly at the beginning, the Amazon ambassadors campaign, using possibly workers, I'll be generous, say possibly workers, to say, how great it is to work there. And I mean, I don't really have a question about it, except that it just seems like a very pivotal moment in public perception and a PR engine that might be, sputtering out, or, I always wonder, am I in a bubble? Like, is there sort of a pivot now, the unions being cooler than they have been in the past, or more relevant to working people, or people could see themselves in a union who may have thought they weren't in a union sector before? Are you noticing anything about this current moment that's?
I think that's a really, good point, because there absolutely is something about like both the like material conditions and dignity of working people's lives, folks that are working for wages, that I think absolutely, I think this is what you're saying, Jennifer, like has a certain set of like currency and meaning, and kind of, in other places call it like a certain kind of like capital. But I think in the face of that, and look at the like just obscene profits that Amazon and all these other folks have made during the pandemic, that are in many ways indefensible. So what I notice is that like far from trying to defend it, right, or like defend the sanctity of private property somehow, you'll just often see corporations really trying to associate themselves with the, the kind of like culture and spirit of work and the well-being of working people. And I think it's partly why we're seeing so much corporate interest in at least nominally like naming formations like Black Lives Matter, even if they don't change any of their material practices. I think they're seeing some of the payoff of the associations. For me, it's a kind of appropriation of social movement labor. Because if you think about who are the folks that made Black Lives Matter as a term and a social vision matter, it was the folks that went into the streets at great risk for themselves to raise this as a conflict. And now you're seeing corporations come in after that's been invested and given energy and making use of it, taking it for their own, to kind of indemnify themselves. And I think you're seeing the same thing, about Amazon and working people, taking the labor that workers have put in to raising their issues, communicating all the things that they face, and using it to help declare themselves innocent for that. And I think that's part of what we're seeing. And I just think that, like, the challenge that unions are facing is that this notion that unions are antiquated, that they're not nimble and like at the forefront of modern economy and society is, it's a real challenge to think then about this intense PR machine and how unions can respond to that.
And considering the earlier question about the percentage of union households that voted, not just for Trump, but for a platform that messaged it, that took over the media and the message of white supremacy. And when you think about the common good, how do we as labor folks rethink our outreach to groups that seems to be recruited by that message?
Right. I guess I have just two quick thoughts about that. The one is, I'm not, in this book that Joe and I wrote, part of the work that we did was on, folks in Oregon know the militia folks. All the stuff we saw on January 6th, folks in Oregon have seen for years and years. There was no surprises there, right? Sure. They were in Salem long before that. So, I'm not suggesting, therefore, it's like start leafleting at the militia rallies, like we have to, speak to them. That's not the kind of point. Although I will say that those folks themselves are very much in formation. They're trying to assimilate and take on these new, ideas. But one thing that I was really struck by this last election is, in spite of all of Trump's venomous nativism, racism, white supremacy, the growth, he doubled 75 million people, right?
Right.
Elected him. And the growth in many communities of color surprised just many of us. And there's lots of reasons for it. It has to do with the differential campaigns, et cetera. But I guess part of what I want to say is the notion that any of us are immune to nativism, to misogyny, white supremacy, by nature of our own identities and experiences, I absolutely think has to be revisited. So there's not there's some magic circle of 60 million of us that never entertain those thoughts. The outburst of anti-Asian violence shows that all of these dynamics are in us. They're in us. And if we're not taking active steps within our organizations to have conversations about those, to think about our complicity in them, to think about new possibilities, we should not be surprised. There's nothing surprising about that 40%. Why would that not also be in all of our unions, in our community organizations, in our churches, everywhere? That's in the DNA of our country. And I do a lot of work with public school teachers on anti-racist curriculum. And that's part of the the students are given so little opportunity to critically engage these histories. And we shouldn't be surprised that we're, the default is not anti-racism. The default is bigotry and humiliation. And we need much more coordinated, organized efforts to address these, because again, it seeps into all of our work in organizations.
Sure.
I see a hand. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Let's go with the hand.
Okay, yeah. Rob, you want to go ahead and ask your own question?
Yeah, it's perfect timing, because the issue that Sherman and Daniel were just discussing about the challenge here is, I just want to amplify it, because, and kind of put the question out there, especially in a public employees union where we have to renegotiate our contract every 2 years, right? With the state budget, for example. Historically, union leadership and union work, that task alone uses up the energy, the resources, I mean, the human resources of the people involved in the union. And it seems like, you know, I don't know about other unions, but the one I'm in, we're having a great difficulty adapting to the making moves, you know, to adapt to this new setting, to actually be inclusive of a broader representative group of our membership, to actually be an anti-racist union, to actually be a feminist union. I'm like, it's more like I don't know if I'm asking a question or making a plea of like, how do we as human beings draw the energy and focus to change and expand our missions and bring it to work? Like,
Yeah.
how do we get that?
Yeah. So I just want to say, first of all, I like appreciate like just the candid way you've said that, and also just the way it feels, right? The way it feels like overwhelming. It is absolutely difficult enough to get folks to come to bargaining, to, you know, even to do, you know, like complete contracts, you know, priority surveys, all of that work. So I do think that the lessons we learn from groups like, you know, both the Chicago teachers and UTLA, and I mean, not just to like lift up only those, but they clearly saw that, you know, well in advance of their contracts, because these were not unions that were always doing that work. They had to start engaging in these questions. And they really thought about it the way you would in organizing, like looking at where our members are, looking at the different sites they're in, looking at the leadership that's there, thinking about the local issues where you can build connection and education. But I think the point is that they had some sense of what they were trying to build, and using these kind of like issues over time to build that. Because I think you're exactly right. If it's, you know, contract time, that's a very difficult time simply to add an issue. And it's also hard if the notion of the anti-racism is like separated from the contract issues, right? So because then it becomes this like, hey, and could you also support immigrant rights? It does the same work of putting those things aside.
And I think it's extra tricky because in the contract negotiation piece, it feels like almost every individual member wants to defend their own piece and wants their own interests forward. And our union is way more white than our community. You know, our union is way more middle class than our community and the people we're drawing new members from. So we tend to preserve the white power structure, even in our own union.
Yeah.
It's rough.
You know what I think the book that's put in the chat, the Teachers Union of Social Justice, really is wonderful, because I think it shows just how long-term formidable, but ultimately, look, I think, you know, the status quo approach of trying to draft a handful of people to get the union through the next contract, that's not going to be sustainable forever. And, you know, many localities now have the benefit of the federal stimulus money. So it's like the cuts aren't imminent. But, you know, look, all the employers can know who's well organized and who's not. And there's no reason to think that they won't be coming after people after this round of, you know, funding is over. So, you know, one way to think about it is like, really now is the time to think about what a union looks like for the long term. The other thing I just appreciate about that is, I don't think this is just like a moral failing of like unions. I think you're exactly right. It's the structural conditions, the ways that contracts focus on such a narrow set of issues that naturally socializes people into saying, well, this is what my concern is, and that's their concern. So, you know, in Connecticut, part of what they've at least tried to do is time a broad range of public sector contracts so that they're expiring together, so that it kind of, again, puts people's, you know, fate. I mean, that's the question, right? The traditional organization of the contract says, how we do in this negotiation is only about us. Our fate is not tied to anyone else. And so I think part of the question is, how do you broaden people's sense of how their fate is linked together?
Thank you. Ariana, would you like to ask a question now?
Sure. So this has been amazing to think about, and this idea, yeah, there's so much in here. So I did not expect to be in a union leadership role. I just got into it accidentally. But as I think about that, I've now been doing it for 5 years, and all of the problems that we're dealing with as adjunct faculty, which is my union, are actually linked to, like, we can't solve them within our we can't solve them within our union, we can't solve them within our institution, we can't even solve them within our state, you know. But I do want to get to a point where I am talking with other people about what are these shared strategies that we're going to use to solve the problems. So like, I almost just want to ask the question, which are like, what are the push points? Like, where do we need to push right now to have unions be advocating for policies and practices and legislations that will actually transform working conditions for people? And so then in my mind, I'm just gonna like propose, I feel like the whole thing around legislation around the gig workers is something that to me is like, that's a place where unions are actually potentially gonna just crumble, because people will fall out of unions into the gig economy. So I'm curious about people's thoughts on that, but more like, what are other push points?
Yeah, so I think you just articulated that really well, and I'd love to hear other folks' thoughts. I mean, I'll just want to point just one thing to, you know, in Washington State, there is this big, and I think it's going to pass in the legislature, this campaign, Communities for Our Colleges, that really centered on linking student organizing among community college students to, which are, you know, this like thousands and thousands of young people, mostly all working class immigrant folks of color, who have like very wide ranging politics, and helping them to think about the conditions of their learning, the relationship between the state budget, between the tax breaks that Amazon is constantly demanding, and you know, the accessibility of these institutions, and then getting them into conversation with the faculty union, with the staff union, and when the budget came before the legislature, constantly being in conversation, doing public hearings about this. So I think I guess part of what I'm just saying, what I've learned from them is it's not just about like signing on to a platform. You have to give students experiences about hearing faculty talk about their issues. Faculty have to have experiences listening to students talk about those. And that deepens it. And that gets us past like, shoot, who are we going to get to be in the bargaining team because nobody wants to do it, right? So that's partly what I've learned from them. Yeah. And, they did calls with, I think they had like 550 students, faculty, and staff on their calls with their local congressperson, trying to push them, and gave people an analysis. Look at what Amazon's trying to do. Look at what the corporations are trying to do. They're trying to exempt themselves from it in order for our contracts to be funded, for tuition hikes to be protected. We all have an interest in raising the revenue that needs to happen for that.
And so, Dan, speaking of that, when you think about public reconstruction, what's the conversation we need to have, grassroots folks, social justice folks, about the role of government? Because one of the things that historically right-wing folks have been successful at is demonizing government and promoting free markets, right? And so when you think about the Amazon, you think about corporate tax breaks and things of that nature, we somehow or another, from a political economy conversation, I think we're missing the boat. And so I'll leave it at that. Help me understand what your research, how do we have this conversation about a 21st century economy that is also not demonizing the role of government? Yeah,
I mean, that hits it, I think, absolutely right there, Sherman. I just want to offer a couple of things in response. One is, and this is just a trip, like during the pandemic, right? Like absent the government, the devastation of it would have been far worse, right? Mm-hmm. So this is from federal stimulus, from schools in my community. Our schools, public schools, turned into food banks. They kept people fed. They kept people who had lost their jobs. So, and yet we missed an opportunity, I think, to make visible all that work that was happening, even as people like understood it. Because the other thing that's happening is people's dependence on markets also increased, right? So at the same time that was happening, we were all reliant, many of us on Zoom, Google Classroom, Amazon, Walmart. So it's not just a kind of ideology, it's the material ways we depend on both. And I think to, it's been so clear, the right-wing attacks, they've been so clear about when you just say the word taxes or taxpayer rights or austerity, it mobilizes a whole set of worldviews and feelings about this. And we just tend not to invest in those same kinds of ideas. The second thing I just want to say, Sherman, in response to this is, look, like the state, and this was the other big lesson of last summer, is both a source of like potentially like life and possibility, and also violence for many people. So we can immediately think about law enforcement, but also prisons, but also like land theft and colonization, and then just like the ways the state monitors and the ambivalence many people have about it. So that's partly why I think about reconstruction as it's not just like, hey, get us back to the New Deal, hey, get us back to this version of the state. It really is. I mean, there's a comment about mutual aid. It really is about building something new, a version of the public that I don't think many of us in our lives have experienced. So that I absolutely think of as the work ahead. And I guess the very last thing I'll say, the reconstruction obviously is a hearkening back to like Reconstruction, and in particular, a Black-led multiracial vision of what the public could provide to people, right? We know from the South that many landless white folks didn't have access to schools, didn't have the vote. There was not, because it wasn't in the planters' interest. So that vision of Reconstruction was about building life possibility for Black people, but in ways that were liberating for many others. And I think that's part of what, when we talk about whether it's a vision of abolition or a vision of like quality education or schools, to be able to talk in universal terms about why these institutions would be so important in our lives. So I think, you're getting at all those things right there.
Okay. I know we're winding down. Maybe one more question, but I'm also, Dan, I'll be reaching out to you because I'm doing work now in the South, and Morehouse is now creating a labor center because I want to have this conversation about race and how racism is also bad for white working class, because you always hear this notion that we're voting against our interests. But when you kind of think about the conversation, are we really having conversations about our shared interests? Right. So how we become transformational in the sense of empowerment and really thinking through reimagining, public education. And last week we attempted to do some of that by revisiting Brown versus Board of Education. And these are complex issues, and there's a lot of division about, the stigma associated with public schools, et cetera. But it is also, what I'm hearing you saying is that stigma is now carried on unions. And so the boss is now manipulating what's best for workers has to be best for the employer in that sense. And so they are now exploiting the fact that we have not figured out a good counterpunch.
I think that's really, really well put, and that we haven't laid, we have a lot of work to do to lay out a vision of why an investment in these public institutions. I mean, we can see it around many issues, right? Around healthcare, we can see it around like transportation, we can see it around, many, many housing issues, right? So we think about all the power and the authority that the banks and lenders had, in the housing market. Plenty of white people lost out in that sense.
Exactly.
So, right. So there's also that kind of like fiction that somehow markets actually protect and benefit, people in that way. And I guess partly, just on the last thing about, the Morehouse is, I do think this is a chance for like labor centers. Like there's only so much collective bargaining trainings that can be done now. And we all know that's not going to respond to this. So thinking about what the role of labor centers are in labor education and popular education is to help people respond to these very vexing conditions, I think is something that needs to be, we have to figure out.
Okay, Jennifer, you want to close us out unless there's another pressing question?
Just such an interesting dynamic discussion happening in the chat, and just appreciate you all so much for bringing your thoughts and questions and helping educate us all with your thoughts too. Really interesting discussion there. And would love to hear more about. I just was on a call with next time we'll schedule another time with you, Dan, but on a Zoom call with our Congressperson Peter DeFazio, and just talking about how last infrastructure bill was in '93, and we're just have a crumbling infrastructure, and this whole idea of austerity and how that affects us all, and how the privatization ties into that, and it's just a big tangle to work through.
Yeah, and just, look, we're going to see the effects of like government and its presence and what it, hopefully can do. And we have to talk about accountability. We have to talk about democratic control, but we also can't let this moment go, right? As something, we can see all over markets failing to meet people's needs. And yet what opportunities do we have to talk to one another about that?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time and energy and knowledge and sharing with us. And we really hope to see you again for another one of these and continue the discussion.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.